Hello, and welcome to another session of Excel Programming for Clinicians with me, Dolorson Callum. In this session, we will take a look at some Excel file operations. Specifically, we will look at two different ways to open an Excel workbook. The first approach will be to ask the user to select a file to open, and the second approach will be if we have a predetermined file location and we know where it is in the directory structure and we can open it ourselves. Next, we'll look at how to save a file programmatically, as well as how to do save as programmatically. After that, we'll do a save as by asking the user to provide the file location. Finally, we'll look at how to close an Excel workbook programmatically. Okay, let's start by taking a look at how to ask the user for the file they want to open and then open it for them programmatically. Okay, the first step is to ask the user which file they want to open. So for that, I'm going to declare a variable. The way we get the selected file is to use the application object and call the getOpenFileName method. This opens up the file open dialog box that you're familiar with, and the user then selects a file and that file name is put into our variable. We can then call the workbooks object open method and pass in our selected file. So the workbook object has an open method which takes a selected file name, and when you pass that in, it opens the file. Let's run the code and see what we get. And you can see the file dialog box has opened. I can select a file, click on open, and that file is opened for me. Let's run the code again. And this time, instead of selecting a file, let's select cancel and see what happens. And as you can see, Excel blows up. Sorry, we can't find false.xlsx. So when you do not provide a file name, getApplicationOpenFileName returns a string of false. And so Open Workbook is looking for a string of false. So to guard against that, we need to say if selected file is not equal to false, then open the file and put our end if. Now let's run that again. Again, we won't select a file, and our application exits gracefully. So every time you're doing a file operation, you should always check what your file operation has returned before you make use of it. Next, let's take a look at how we open the file, but specify the path ourselves instead of asking the user to provide a file. Now, when you do that, you have to check yourself that the file actually exists. That's where the directory function comes in very handy. Let's take a look. I'm going to declare a variable to hold the path to my file, and another variable to hold the full file name. I'm going to specify the file path, and this is a file that's sitting in my OneDrive. To check that the file that I want actually exists, I'm going to use a directory function. I'll pass in my file path, and I'll concatenate that onto my file name. And I will pass that to my file name variable. So now directory function will check this file path and this file name. And if that file exists, it will return the file name. If the file doesn't exist, then we'll get an empty string. So I need to check that the length of my file name is greater than 0. If it is, then I have actually found the file and the file does exist. And as I said, directory function returns a 0-length string if the file doesn't exist. And in my if statement, I can call the workbooks object open method, and I can pass in the file path concatenated onto my file name. Let's put an else in there in case the file doesn't exist. We'll display a message box. And I'm going to make this critical. So I've hard-coded my file path. So I'm using the directory function to check that that file actually exists. This is the file I want, but I put on the path, I concatenate that onto the file name, and if the file exists, directory function will return the file name. If the file doesn't exist, it will return a 0-length string. To check that my file exists, I'll use the length function to make sure the file name length is greater than 0. If it is, then I'll use the open method of the workbooks object, and I'll pass in the file path and name. And of course, if its file doesn't exist, then I'll pass in an error message, which I've set to be critical. Let's run that and see what we get. And as you can see, it's opened my file and displayed it for me. Let's see what would happen if that file didn't exist. Let me change the file name and run it again. And this time my message box is displayed. The file name or path does not exist, and it's a critical message. Next, let's take a look at how to save an Excel file programmatically. Let's copy this code we used to open the file so that we can open it again. Remembering, of course, to change our file name back to the file that does exist. So up to this point, we are opening the file. Let's assume the user has made some changes and now we want to save the file. First thing we need to do is make sure that the file we want to save is the active one. So let's declare a variable to hold the active file name that we want to save. And here I've created a variable and I'm declaring it to be of type workbook. So my variable will hold an Excel workbook. To set a variable equal to a workbook, we use the set keyword. And I'm going to go to the workbooks object. And I want to look at all the items in the workbooks object. And I want to select the one that's called diagnosis. So having opened my workbook, allow the user to work with it. I'm now iterating through all the items in the workbooks object, and I'm finding the one with name diagnosis, and I'm setting that to my diagnosis variable. Now, because the user may have closed the file themselves, we need to check that the diagnosis workbook is actually open. The way we do that, having set it here, is to check that this is not equal to nothing. Let's do that. We'll say if not diagnosis workbook is nothing, then we can do what we need to do. Okay, as I said before, anytime you're doing file operations, open, save, you need to check that the file actually exists. In this case, before I save the file, I need to check that the file actually exists, that it's still open. Of course, if it's not open, I need to declare a message box. If it's not open, then I inform the user and I give them a warning in the message box. So let's see how to save it if it is open. If it is open, the first thing we need to do is activate it. Okay, so I'm calling the activate method of the workbooks object and passing in the name of the file. And now, since that's the active workbook, I can call active workbook.save. And let's put a message box there to let the user know the file has been saved. Okay, let's set a breakpoint here and let's run the code and see what we get. So up to this point, the file has been opened. Now let's step through the code. We have set our diagnosis workbook object, and now we're checking to see that it's not nothing, i.e. that the diagnosis file is still open. And it is still open. So now we can activate it, just in case the user has moved off it and is working with a different file. So now it is the active workbook, and now we can call save. And now that's saved. And we can let the user know the file has been saved successfully. And we go to the end of the subroutine. Next, let's take a look at Save As. Save As works very similarly to Save, but obviously allows us to change the file name. Let's copy our save code and use it in our Save As subroutine. Now, when we come to save, instead of using the save method of the active workbook, we will use the Save As method. And when we use Save As, we have to pass in the new file name. And we alert the user. Notice that when we used save, we didn't pass in a file name because it saves with the same name it already has. When we use save as, we have to pass in a file name. Let's set a breakpoint and run the code and see what we get. So our file opens as before, and now we're checking to make sure that the user hasn't closed it while we were doing something else. And the file still exists. We activate it. We call save as, and it's saved. And you can see the file name has changed to diagnosis v2. And we end our program. Next, let's see how we can do a save as, but this time get the user to provide the file name instead of us providing it programmatically. Let's copy the code we used before because it will be very similar. Let's paste it in our user save as function. And let's make some changes. The two lines we're going to change are these save as line and the message box. So let's comment these out. And let's declare a new variable to hold our new file name provided by the user. Previous steps will be the same. We will open the file as before. Before saving, we will check that the file exists and is still open. We will activate it as before. And this time, we will use the application object and we'll use the get save as file name method to open up the dialog box and get the user to provide a file name. Then as before, we'll use the active workbook save as method And this time we'll pass in the user file name. And we have to concatenate on the file extension. Let's display a message box letting the user know their file has been saved. Okay, so we're using the application object's get save as file name method, which pops up a dialog box and allows the user to provide a file name. We capture that in a variable, and then we pass that variable with the file extension to the active workbook save as method. And then we let the user know that the file has been saved. Let's remove these commented out lines. Let's set a breakpoint, and let's run the code and see what we get. So the file has been opened. We'll check that it's still open, and it is. We activate it, and we pop up the dialog box. And this time, we'll save it, give it a file name, click on save, and continue to step through the code, and that's been saved. We're now in V3, and we let the user know the file has been saved. And we end the code. Next, let's take a look at how to close an Excel workbook. Let's copy our previous code from our save as routine, paste it in our close method, and let's make the changes, this time not to save the workbook, but to close it. So I'll delete these two lines that do the save as, and we'll see how to close the workbook. So as before, we open our Excel workbook, we check that that file is still open, and if it is, we activate it. And now that it is active, we can call the active workbook object close method and just say the file has been closed. Okay, so we're opening the file same as before. We're checking that the file is still open, and if it is, we're activating it. And then once activated, we're calling the close method of the active workbook object. Let's set a breakpoint and step through the code. So we've opened the file. We step through and check that that file is still open. We activate it, and it's now the active workbook, and we close it. And we let the user know the file has been closed. Another way to close a file, let's comment out the active workbook close method, is to get the file name and use that to close it. So what we can do is we can use the workbooks object and pass in active workbook name property and then call the close method. So instead of using the active workbook close method, we can use the workbooks close method by passing in the name of the active workbook. Let's run that code and see what it looks like. Again, the file is opened. We check that it is still open. If it is, we activate it. And now we're passing in the name of the active workbook to the workbook's close method. And that closes the file. And we let the user know the file has been closed. Great, so we've had a really quick overview of some of the key Excel open, close, save as, and save operations, which stands us in good stead to open files, close files, import data, and export data. Great, so I hope you find that interesting and useful, and I will see you in the next video.